We're continuing our discussions on World War II, looking at the height of the war and when the Allies start turning the tide. Look at Midway, Stalingrad, D-Day, Battle of the Bulge. Look at the Manhattan Project, bombings at Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Holocaust, the horrors of this crime against humanity. Also looking at mobilization and other policies which are aiding the Allies, and compare that with the Axis powers. Now, prior to the war, Franklin Roosevelt was attempting to help aid the Allies while the United States was still technically neutral. Roosevelt realized the war would eventually come to the United States, but he could not simply just throw the United States into a war. The population was still shaken by memories of World War I, by the Great Depression, a military that was by far nowhere near ready to face combat. But Roosevelt persisted with the Lend-Lease Act, which gave necessary aid to the Allies, weapons by leasing, lending it, selling it to the Allies to keep them in the fight. He also made bold stands against the movements of the Axis powers. 1941, in an Atlantic meeting with Winston Churchill, two met and devised what can be called the Atlantic Charter, a series of aims which were eventually signed by representatives of the 25 anti-Axis nations, which called for what the Allies stood for in the war, which was, among other things, echoing many of Woodrow Wilson's ideas from 14 points, but expanding on those also. Decolonialization, free self-determination for nations, defending the rights of neutral powers, absolute freedom of navigation on the seas. Like I say, among many other elements of it. But World War II, we also have to keep in mind, it was a long, difficult war, very bloody war, and it took the Allies absolutely everything they had to win the fight. Absolutely everything. Even then it was just barely enough. The Allies took heavy casualties. In the early phase of the war, the Allies were being rolled back everywhere. In the late 1941, Britain was essentially the only country left facing the Axis, still standing. There comes another thing you have to understand about life is there are times you can be absolutely 100% right and still be losing, and still lose. Britain was facing that horrifying prospect, 1940-41. But what it took for the Allied powers to win was some of those great traits that make a men worth admiring. Dedication, that is, to the cause of the Allies. Dedication to each other. Loyalty. Bravery. Men had to throw themselves in positions knowing they probably weren't coming back. Men willing to give their lives for others. Men willing to give their lives for their country. Although American General George S. Patton very cleverly pointed out that the job of the fighting man is, American soldier, is not to die for his country, it's to make the other man die for his country. Well, they put it in much more colorful terms. But it took soldiers in the trenches, in the air, on the ground, in the seas, and the civilians at home, doing everything they could to try to keep this effort going. 3 major battles ended up turning the tide of the war. El Alamein in Egypt, Midway, Stalingrad. Now, I'm talking about El Alamein, where British General Sir Vernon Montgomery had hurled back Edwin Rommel's Nazi advance into Egypt towards the Suez Canal in the Middle East, which turned out to be the beginning, the end of an Axis control of North Africa. The Battle of the Coral Sea, spring of 1942. Like I say, the Americans just barely managed to turn back the Japanese naval advance moving towards Australia. The times were difficult. Early 1942, out of the spirit of defense, American soldiers had no choice but to surrender the Philippines. The entire Philippine islands fell to the Japanese. And what the Japanese did was unconscionable to against the American prisoners, as well as British and other Allied prisoners might happen to be captured. The Japanese forced the American soldiers to march hundreds of miles to prisoner of war camps. They were given no food or water. Filipinos who sympathized with the Americans tossed food or water to the Americans were killed by the Japanese on sight. So hundreds of Americans died, what came to call the Bataan Death March. In Japanese POW camps, Allied prisoners those few who were taken, were tortured, mutilated, starved, denied medical care. And so the very basic elements that define the Geneva Convention, the Japanese willfully ignored. The Japanese felt that to surrender is dishonor, so very few Japanese soldiers surrendered during World War II. But the treatment of the prisoners they took simply horrifying. They had little food, slave labor, torture, beatings. In many cases, sold POWs just outright killed. There were several pictures circulating during the war of Japanese officers pulling out their swords and about to chop off the heads of American prisoners who were bound and forced to their knees, and Japanese chopping off the heads. Something that so many American survivors took a very long time to ever forgive. Certainly did not ever forget. But Midway, Japanese were priming to finish off the American fleet. Now, this is one of those battles that shows us how the importance of counterintelligence was in the Allied war effort. Being able to find out what the enemy is doing, figure out and make a plan accordingly. A lot of spying, placing spies in place, covert surveillance, and just picking up their coded messages. So the U.S. had broken Japanese code by this point, by 1942, but the Japanese were using code on top of a code. Because the Americans couldn't figure out that the Japanese had a code word for their target for the new attack against the American fleet, but Americans couldn't figure out what it was. So what ended up happening was American intelligence had narrowed down the potential targets to Midway Island or another attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, the thing about Midway is it's a small island 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii. Actually, it's isolated. It doesn't have a lot of natural sources of water. So, what the military had to use had to be brought in from Hawaii. Now, the U.S. Navy couldn't be in two places at once, so what happened? So the American intelligence decided they had Midway send out a low-level message to Hawaii saying that They were out of water and needed some more. And of course, it was on open shortwave radio, so it's broadcast all over the Pacific. So the Japanese picked this up and broadcast back to Japan, which is also heard all over the Pacific. The target has a problem. The Americans knew midway. June 3rd through 6th, 1942, was perhaps the largest naval battle in history. The U.S. and Japanese forces fought it out. Bitter fighting using submarines, battleships, aircraft carriers, aircraft, round and round, back and forth for days. The U.S. lost one aircraft carrier, but the Japanese lost 4. The Japanese were dealt a devastating defeat, turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. The U.S. will be on the offensive for the remainder of the war in the Pacific, although it will be very long, difficult fighting. The Japanese military acknowledged after the war that they knew they had lost the war at Midway, and they were determined to keep fighting for 3 more years. But the aircraft carrier would be essential because so many, or the fighting over so many small islands in the South Pacific. These isolated islands didn't have a lot of population, certainly no airstrips, so the navies of both powers had to basically bring their airports with them because air power now was so essential to fighting the war. For surveillance, for bombing, so many other things. So, aircraft carriers, you've got maintenance, you've got fuel, you've got the aircraft themselves, a place to land, was moving from port to port as the Allies advanced. It would be one of the decisive advantages for U.S. and Allied forces in the Pacific. Now, while under Nazi rule in Europe in the meantime, Nazi lands were subject to different rules according to ethnicity. Some were annexed directly into Germany, and some that were called Aryan states. There's no really such thing as an Aryan, but it's the belief of Germans believe that this race existed, blonde hair, blue eyes, so forth. But these Aryan states, they're called, particularly Denmark and Norway, had civilian administrations controlled by Germany. Often called a Reichskommissariat. There's a Reichscommissioner. But nevertheless, it was a military dictatorship. It just happened to have civilian commanders. For the Latin races, such as France and elsewhere, it's under direct military administration, outright military dictatorship. In no area was any kind of freedom or relief. Populations brutalized, dissidents round up and shot or sent to concentration camps. The Nazis mercilessly exploited the resources of the conquered territories, both in terms of manpower and raw materials. They tried to resettle many areas. Heinrich Himmler, who was in charge of concentration camps, the Gestapo, and other programs, was also in charge of this resettlement. In western Poland, 1 million Poles were uprooted, kicked out of the entire area, and 2 million Germans were sent in by 1942, taking those homes and farms that the Poles had been evicted from. Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians are to become slave labor. Western Russia, that is, they wrestle of the Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, would be Germanized. Moscow itself would be destroyed and turned into a giant lake. And we start seeing the beginnings of the Holocaust. Now, Hitler's systematic hatred of the Jews was well known, but he moved very slowly in the process of extermination. But he never made it a secret that that was his ultimate goal. By 1939, many Jews were encouraged to immigrate from Germany, but by that point, many of those left in Germany usually had very little means by which to escape. The you understand the pre-war Jewish population of Germany was 1939 was only 210,000 out of a total population of nearly 70 million. But 170,000 of those Jews, 81%, would be slaughtered. Now, the final solution, as it was called, was developed in early 1941. Now, understand about the final solution, the Wannsee Conference, as it was also called, Wannsee Conference. It was not a decision whether or not what they were going to do with the Jews. They're deciding how they were going to get rid of them. Himmler, of course, would be directly in charge of it. Ultimately, nearly 6 million Jews were slaughtered. You'll see here, distributed, developed by Dr. Bull Lowry, one of my old graduate school historians, a great man. Gathers from a number of sources. Das Dritte Reich und die Juden, Dokumente und Essays, basically the Third Reich and the Jews, documents and essays, what they call the Holocaust Reader, estimates by Sir Martin Gilbert. Of the Jews killed, just the Jews, there were many others killed as well. 1 million were killed by roaming SS troops, killed and stacked in mass graves. 5 million more died in the concentration camps and the death camps. Well, usually what happened is they'd be divided up when they were, so they came to these concentration camps. Jews were herded in ghettos initially, so they'd be processed and slowly sent to these concentration camps or death camps. Death camps are just outright exterminated. Concentration camps, usually slow torture, death by malnutrition, disease, torture, outright murder. Okay. But either case, and then death, countless innocents. The Germans, once they got the Jews at these camps, they divide them up, split up the families. Women and children were sent to these chambers, being told they were being showered for delousing. All their possessions were taken from them, and in these chambers they would be gassed to death. Bodies burned. Now, as you can see from the map in the book here, particularly page 870, most of the concentration camps and death camps are in eastern Germany, extending out towards portions of Austria and Poland. A couple in Estonia, one in France, a couple in Yugoslavia. Essentially where the bulk of the Jewish population existed. The Jews were forced to build these camps themselves. And at the gates of all of them, they had this metal sign, this metal gate with a slogan mocking them, Arbeit macht frei, which means German, work makes you free. Some women were kept alive as slave labor. Men and women, some children were kept alive using these horrifying medical experiments, such as having their organs or vital organs removed to see how long they'd live without them. About 30% were sent to slave labor camps. Next to children, if they seem to be adults, old enough or strong enough, they will be spared the use of slave labor. German corporations used a lot of these Jews as slave labor. Volkswagen, chemical companies, other manufacturers, other Mercedes, BMW. But they were stripped of everything. Their valuables, dignity, freedom, their lives. The Jews had their heads shaved. The hair would be used to stuff mattresses and pillows, be used by the German public, the German army. Wedding rings, watches were stripped from them, given out to the Nazi elites. Whatever gold they had on them was melted down, stored in bank vaults across Germany and even in Switzerland. Even the gold fillings in the teeth were stripped from them, melted down to go for gold. Even more still, some of these concentration camp guards, after these people were killed, took the skin of some Holocaust survivors and used it as lampshades. Atrocity, the nightmare, just beyond description. These camps were in operation by 1942. Like I said, there have been many books written about it since. Many of them quite excellent, very haunting. One of them is Night by Eli Wiesel. He was 14 when he was sent to a concentration camp. He was the only one member of his family to survive, except for a few scattered cousins. He was able to convince the guards he was grown, and that saved him. But basically, Night is about his stories of growing up in a concentration camp. Next set of the numbers we have here just from the Jewish population. Austria, 40,000 of 60,000 were killed, 67%. So they weren't even 1% of the population. Belgium, another 40,000. Czechoslovakia, 315,000 pre-war population, 260,000 were killed. 5 out of every 6. Denmark, the Danish government managed to get as many Jews in their country, of the 8,000 they could, out of the country to neutral Sweden, saving their lives. France, 90,000, 26% of the population. As you go further east, the highest casualties are found. Hungary, 200,000 of the 400,000 Jews before the war killed. With Poland, pre-war Jewish population of 3.3 million, 2.8 million are killed, 85%. Romania, half the 850,000, 425,000 are killed. German-occupied Russia, 1.5 million out of the 2.1 million, 71%. Baltic states, between 89 and 90% of the Jewish population wiped out. And this is just the Jewish population. 9 to 10 million others were killed by shooting, in these concentration camps, were killed by shooting, by overwork, by starvation. Of the Gypsy population, 400,000 are killed. 40%. Of the 9 to 10 million others killed included 4 million Poles, Ukrainians, White Russians died in slave labor camps. 3 to 4 million Soviet POWs were killed. This goes on and on. Hitler killed the handicapped, the elderly, homosexuals, and Jehovah's Witnesses, people just didn't fit into his ideas of what the world should be. Nightmarish vision. Like I said, the church was taken over into the National Right Church. That is, they could only, preachers could only preach what the German government told them to preach. One German preacher in that time was a man named Martin Niemöller. He actually had supported Hitler's rise to power in the 1930s. Proclaimed fearing of what the communists could do to churches in Germany. He was a Lutheran preacher. But after the late 1930s, he saw what Hitler was all about again, speaking out against them. Niemöller was arrested and put in a concentration camp until he was freed in 1945. Afterward, Niemöller went around the world as a peace activist, speaking out against discrimination, racism, and hatred, closing each of his speeches for decades afterward with a variation on the same ending. When they first came for the Jews, I did not speak up because I was not a Jew. When they came for the trade unionists, I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. When they came for me, no one spoke up for me because no one was left. In the East, the war is a bitter race war, unspeakable hatred going back and forth. In Ukraine, which had been forcibly subjugated by the Soviet Union, you had a population that's deeply divided. Should they go with Stalin, the man who brutalized millions of their own people, or Hitler, a man who was just as bad, but just going after Stalin? A lot of Ukrainians went with Hitler, a lot went with Stalin. It's between a rock and a hard place. In the Soviet-occupied areas, Holocaust went on. What you understand about the Holocaust here is not one of these German officials denied it happened. At the Nuremberg war crimes trials after the war, the late 1940s, 1945 onward, they simply tried to give the defense that they were ordered to do so, that they were acting under orders. That was never found to be an acceptable defense because there are some orders that they're too immoral to carry out. But they had documents, witnesses. This is one report from one witness of the Nuremberg war crimes trials. This is following from the testimony of a German construction engineer who witnessed the mass murder of Jews at Dubno in Ukraine on October 5, 1942. He said in his testimony, quote, "On October 5, 1942, when I was visited building offices at Dubno, my foreman told me that in the vicinity of the site, Jews from Dubno had been seen shot in 3 large pits, each about 30 meters long, 3 meters deep. About 1,500 persons had been killed daily. All the 5,000 Jews had still been living in Dubno before the pogrom were to be liquidated. He'd been murdered. The shooting had taken place in his presence. He was still much upset. Thereupon I drove to the site accompanied by my foreman and saw near it the great mounds of earth, about 30 meters long, 2 meters high. Several trucks stood in front of the mounds. Armed Ukrainian militia drove the people off the trucks with supervision of SS men. Militiamen acted as guards on the trucks and drove them to and from the pit. All these people had the regulation yellow patches in front and back of their clothes, thus be recognized as Jews. They're all forced to wear these distinctive yellow stars of David. Other groups were forced to wear other things to signal their racial or social identity. My foreman and I went directly to the pits. No one bothered us. I heard rifle shots in quick succession from behind one of the earth mounds. People got off the trucks. Men, women, and children of all ages had to undress upon the order of the SS man, carried a riding or dog whip. They had to put down their clothes in fixed places, sorted according to shoes, top clothing, underclothing. So I get cheap of shoes, about 800 to 1,000 pairs, great piles of underlinen clothing. Screaming or weeping, these people undressed, stood around family groups, kissed each other, said farewells, waited for a sign from another SS man. Stood near the pit, also with a whip in his hand. In the 15 minutes that I stood near it, I heard no complaint or plea for mercy. Watched a family of about 8 persons, a man and a woman, both about 50 with their children, one about 1, 8, and 10, 2 grown-up daughters, about 20 to 29. An old woman with snow white hair was holding the 1-year-old in her arms and seeing to it, tickling it. The child was cooing with delight. The couple were looking on with tears in their eyes. Father was holding the hand of a boy about 10 years old and speaking to him softly. The boy was fighting his tears. Father pointed to the sky, stroked his head, and seemed to explain something to him. At that moment, the SS man at the pit shouted something to his comrade. The latter counted off between about 20 persons, instructed them to go behind the earth mound. Among them was the family which I had mentioned. I will remember a girl, slim, black hair, who, as she passed close to me, pointed herself and said 23. Walked around the mound and found myself confronted with a tremendous grave. They were closely wedged together and lying on top of each other so that only their heads were visible. They all had blood running over their shoulders from their heads. Some of the people shot were still moving. Some were lifting their arms and turning their heads to show they were still alive. The pit was already 2/3 full. This may already contain 1,000 people. And this was the reality of the Holocaust. This is the death of evil to which human beings were capable. This is what the Allies were fighting to stop. There were rumors of what was happening during the war leaking out, that the Allied high commands knew this was happening, but there was nothing they could do about it. There's so many other targets, and they had so many limited resources to fight with. Instead of bombing the camps, which would have been killing civilians, and the survivors would have to rebuild these camps again, the decision was made to concentrate on military targets to wear down the ability of the Nazis to continue to fight. They did this knowing that these people were being slaughtered. They also did it knowing that the Nazi military continued to advance. This nightmare could spread all over the world. It would come to Britain, it would come to Canada, it would come to the United States. It would swallow up the remainder of Russia. It took many, many years to free these lands from Nazi occupation. The major powers mobilized very differently. After the United States had faced no war on its territory, reached peak military productivity in November 1943, 6 ships per day, producing up to $6 billion in war material a month. That's $80–90 billion in today's money. Constructed new factories led to boom towns. Because so many people are working on constructing these factories, sometimes in rural areas that didn't have any industrialization before, there were no homes to house the workers. But there was no one there to, because since all the builders are building factories, there's no one to build houses. So there are housing shortages. Very few schools are available. Very few doctors, because most of them are helping the troops, serving the Army or the Navy. It's massive uprooting of the population because of the draft in the United States are moving to new jobs. Massive migration to the cities. 16 million men and women in the United States enrolled in the military. Women weren't in active military units, but they served in such units as the WACs, the Waves. The WAC is Women's Air Corps, basically. Have all women serving as test pilots, delivering these planes to forward bases. A lot of women serving in the Navy nursing program. A lot serving in as clerical positions and logistical support. The 16 million men and women. They're coming and going different phases, shifts, but other troops were wounded or others came back in. It was the largest military undertaking in American history. On top of that, 16 million civilians relocated across the country, often moving from the farms to lucrative factory jobs. 1 million African Americans in the rural South moved to the industrial North and West, repeating their experiences of World War I, causing new racial tensions in the cities. June 1943, there was a race riot in Detroit over this. The Soviet Union. Widespread mobilization of the military, also the industry and other areas of the economy. Stalin called this the battle of the machines, trying to convince the Russian people to outproduce the Germans with as many machines and material of war as possible. The Russians produced 78,000 tanks and 98,000 artillery pieces during the war, so counting what they had before the war and what was coming in from Lend-Lease aid. Now, in 1940, 15% of the Soviet gross national product was devoted to military. That's high about 1943. That's up to 55%. More than half of their economy, half all the resources going directly into war production. As a result, you have builders building factories, the civilians moving from the farms to man these factories, and civilians from the farms to the front lines. So as a result, there's no one there to pick the crops, no one there to build the houses for the workers. So there are massive food and housing shortages for Russia during the war. Women worked in industry, mines, and railroads. Women working in industry increased 60%. Russians did put women in combat positions as snipers, as bombardiers, pilots, tank commanders. In Germany, to keep up civilian morale, Hitler refused to firmly convert the economy, increasing production of consumer goods, increasing high amounts of consumer goods continuing to be produced in high amounts. In 1942, he offered massive increases in the army and produced war material. Material tripled, but there were no decreases in consumer goods. It didn't fully mobilize. Only after the Allied invasion of Normandy, D-Day, did the Russians call for total mobilization, July 1944. Schools, theaters, and cafes are closed for the war, so everybody could vote to the war effort. But there's still resistance to women employment. Remember, Hitler wanted women to stay home and give birth to the next generation of Germans who would conquer the world. May 1939, for example, there were 14.6 million German women employed. December 1944, the number was only to 14.9 million. And of course, it was a difficult situation being allied with Russia. Now, Stalin was willing to take whatever casualties it took to win the war. It should never be forgotten that the maniac itself. Case in point was the Katyn Forest massacre. This is in 1940. Remember that Russia had occupied the eastern half of Poland after the Germans had invaded as part of the secret agreement in 1939. Thousands of Poles had tried to seek refuge in Russia, and the Soviet army had rounded up 9,000 Polish officers. Now, these officers, they'd be the leader of any kind of resistance effort to Germans in Poland. It would be the leaders of a post-war Poland. But fearing what they could mean for Soviet domination of Poland after the war, instead Stalin ordered these 9,000 officers to be rounded up and executed at a site called the Katyn Forest. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, the Allies pressed Stalin to explain just what exactly happened to these 9,000 officers. Stalin very dismissively said they went away. Bombing of cities increased tremendously. So air power had advanced considerably between World War I and World War II, and advanced even further in the war. Towards the end of World War II, the Germans would be using jet fighter aircraft, very primitive versions of it. Because of delays, because of Allied bombings, the Germans were never able to produce very many. But it had been theorized in the 1920s that bombing of cities by aircraft would maximize terror, and that even the fact that it might even just force entire populations to surrender just on the threat of the air raid. London was subject to nightly raids during the war. After Hitler developed his early rockets, the V-1 and the V-2 rockets, he launched many of these rockets, the British called the buzz bombs, on top of London. Well, show the devastation of the bombings. The city of Clydebank, Scotland, March 1941. Of the 12,000 houses in the city for that raid, only 7 were left undamaged. Not 7,000, not 700, just 7. $35,000 of the city's 47,000 people were left homeless in one night. The city of Berlin was subject to air raids day and night by Allied forces. Typically, the British would take the day shift and the Americans the night shift. Sometimes they'd switch around. On May 31st, 1942, a fleet of 1,000 Allied bombers raided Cologne. The city of Hamburg, northern Germany, is firebombed. Temperatures at the heart of the city reached more than 1,800 degrees. A quarter of the city was incinerated, 50,000 were killed. February 1945, the city of Dresden was firebombed, leaving 100,000 dead. But of all these raids, though, Nazi war production decreased only 7%. The American bombing of Tokyo the night of March 9th to March 10th, 1945, put 100,000 dead in that city. But the Allies continued to advance. By May 1943, the Allies had forced the Nazis completely out of North Africa and began concentrating on an invasion of southern Italy. Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe, which turned out to be not quite so soft. Summer 1943, the Allies took Sicily. By September, invaded the Italian mainland. Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator, was overthrown and arrested once the Allies invaded, and Italy switched sides. But the Nazis captured Mussolini, took control of Italy, and began throwing everything they had against the American and British forces, trying to move northward into Italy. Rome fell on June 4th, 1944, after heavy fighting in around the city. General Mark Clark led the efforts to retake the ancient capital city. Mussolini was eventually recaptured by the Italians, and he and his mistress, both hated and despised, were executed in April 1945. Their bodies were hung by the feet while people pelted them with rocks and clubs. But D-Day, June 6, 1944, probably one of the distinctive turning points of the war. Now, Stalin had been pressing for the Western Allies to open a second front to relieve the pressure on him in Europe. There's very careful planning and build-up had gone on for years, waiting for that right occasion. Next, the Allied Supreme Commander was American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Next, the Americans and the British and Canadians faked out the Germans, built up here and there, and left no stone unturned for preparation for battle, massing troops, supplies, weapons, whatever they could. It would be the largest amphibious landing in history. And for months, the British and Americans Canadians would try to fake out the Germans. They made up an entire army, one that existed only on paper. saying this is to be the army that attacks the Germans, and the Germans believed it. In part because the Americans had double agents working in the German intelligence agencies, convincing Hitler, not misdirecting Hitler or the German high command. But the British Americans had fake airplanes and fake airports, fake tanks, just paper mache, canvas outlines of them that German reconnaissance flights at sea, and mistakenly assumed these were actual, the real thing. The invasion was eventually scheduled for June 5th, 1944. It was called off because of because of bad weather. Eisenhower actually was prepared to resign if the invasion failed. But on June 6th, the invasion occurred. It's called D-Day because in military terminology it simply means day of the battle, but in popular imagination, D-Day has come to mean the invasion of Normandy. And at 5 landing sites, 2 British, 2 American, and 1 Canadian, the Americans stormed the beaches because after heavy bombardments up and down the coast, again trying to confuse the Germans where they're actually going, pre-dawn paratroop raids and helped by the French resistance try to misdirect the Germans. Eisenhower directed the invasion and landed. Heavy casualties were taken. By the end of the day, the Allies had secured a toehold on the beaches in all 5 locations. And from there, ensuing days linked up, expanded outside of Normandy. By August 1944, Paris was liberated. Nazis attempted to destroy the city, but the commanders simply abandoned it, forced out by he refused to destroy it, and the resistance basically effectively taken over the city. By September 1944, 2 million men and 500,000 vehicles had landed in the Second Front, breaking through the German lines. But by December 1944, after nearly pushing the Germans out of France altogether, the Allies were nearing the German border. The Nazis struck back in a desperate last-ditch offensive into Belgium, and called the Battle of the Bulge because there was a this is Belgium here, France. The Allies are pushing into this area at the front lines of the Germans. The Germans encircled this one area, basically made it look like a bulge coming up the lines. This Battle of the Bulge. Initial phase of the fighting, some of the German soldiers were wearing American uniforms. Uniforms they'd stolen from American prisoners after they captured a few and executed them. This is the last ditch offensive the Germans had, basically trying to divide the Allied forces, push them back. Germans using the last of their reserves, fuel and the manpower forces. But the U.S. and the British repelled the attack. Heavy bombing by American and British bombers disrupted the German lines. American reinforcements were able to come and rescue the forces. And at that, the Allies settled into their positions for the winter. Now the third major battle, backtracking a little bit here, Stalingrad. Now, after failing to capture Moscow in 1941, Leningrad was under siege. Moscow was within their sights. Hitler decides to turn his attention southward towards the Caspian Sea area because of the oil and gas deposits that were known to be there. He was hoping to take advantage of those for fuel for his army. But instead of taking out Moscow, turning his attention south, Okay, Stalingrad, it's a city on the Volga River, major industrial city. Southern Russia, it's called Volgograd today. But as the Germans approached the city, Stalin at this point gave the order there would be no further retreats by the Red Army. Hitler gave the same order to his troops not to dig in. And the two would fight for months in this area. The Nazis attempted to take the city in heavy fighting, and the siege began in November 1942. Very late, starting to get cold, and the Germans basically stuck here through the winter. Actually, the book has a interesting excerpt from a German soldier. German soldier writing on July 29th, 42, said, the company commander says the Russian troops are completely broken, cannot hold out any longer. Reach the Volga, the river, and take Stalingrad is not so difficult for us. The Fuhrer knows where the Russians' weak point is. Victory is not far away. They keep fighting. August 12th, at the morning, outstanding soldiers are presented decorations. One soldier wants to know if he can go back to the girlfriend with the medal. So I believe that for Stalingrad, the Fuhrer will decorate even me. So it was September 4th, so we're being sent northward along the front towards Stalingrad. We marched all night, and by dawn to reach the Vorkoronovo station, basically outside the city. We can see the smoking town. It's a happy thought the end of the war is getting nearer. That's what everyone keeps saying. And given Nazi propaganda, that's probably what they were led to believe. September 8th, 2 days of non-stop fighting. The Russians are defending themselves in staying stubbornness. The regiment has lost many men. September 16th, our battalion plus tanks is attacking the grain storage elevator, which smoke is pouring. Grain is burning. The Russians seem to have set light to it themselves. Barbarism. The battalion is suffering heavy losses. September 10th, the Russians are so close that our planes cannot bomb them. We're preparing for a decisive attack. Fuhrer has ordered the whole Stalingrad be taken as rapidly as possible. Essentially, by that point, they're moving into the city. Germans are putting everything they have into taking the city, but as what's happening is they're slowly being surrounded. November 10th, gets a letter from his girlfriend. It's a letter from Elsa today. Everyone expects us home for Christmas. In Germany, everyone believes we're already holding Stalingrad. How wrong they are if they can only see what Stalingrad has done to our army. In German propaganda, they probably really were told that Stalingrad was in their hands. November 21st, the Russians have gone over the offensive along the whole front. Fierce fighting is going on, so there it is. The Volga, victory, and soon home to our families. Shall also be seeing them in the other world. November 29th, we're encircled. As announced this morning, the Fuhrer said, the Army can trust me to do everything necessary to ensure supplies and rapidly break encirclement. Hitler never sends the reinforcements. Did not allow his commanders in the field to pull their forces out. Basically has them sit there and to be pummeled. December 3rd, we were on hunger rations waiting for the rescue that Fuhrer promised. December 14th, everybody's racked with hunger. Frozen potatoes are the best meal, but to get them out of the ice-covered ground, it's Russian winter. From the ice-covered ground, they're fire from Russian bullets, it's not so easy. December 26th, the horses have already been eaten. I would eat a cat, they say the meat is also tasty. Soldiers are like corpses or lunatics looking for something to put in their mouths. They no longer take cover from Russian shells. They haven't the strength to walk, run away, and hide. Curse in this war. Shortly after this last entry, the soldier was killed. So ultimately, the Germans would end up taking 90% of Stalingrad. It went from street to street, to building to room fighting. Germans and Russians were so close that the German Air Force did not bomb the Russian lines to be able to disrupt the Russians. By early February, the Germans are finished. They're starved, they're completely surrounded. Hitler is unable to break the encirclement. The only message Hitler sends to the commander of the 6th Army is a promotion to Field Marshal. But nothing. So in early February, the German 6th Army and its 300,000 remaining troops surrendered. As a result of this, the German offensive to the east was stopped, and so slowly started rolling back of Nazis. Of those German troops, many that were taken to Siberia, most did not make it back. So the Germans are going to be on the defensive for the rest of the war in the east, suffering heavy casualties, falling back steadily. Neither side offering any kind of mercy or quarter toward each other. Now, summer of 1943, you have the Battle of Kursk. This is in western Russia, north of Ukraine. Week-long battle fought from July 5th through 12th, 1943. Germany is experimenting with a new form of heavy tank. Brought their tanks out in the field and were decisively defeated by the Russians. The experiment didn't go so well. And the Russians continued to roll back the Nazis. By the end of 1943, the siege of Leningrad had lifted after 900 days. 1944, the Baltics are retaken. German resistance continues to crumble. By January 1945, Warsaw was retaken. Ukraine was retaken. So steadily, the Nazis were pushed out from Russia. Now, once the Allies, once D-Day occurred, it would be less than a year for the Nazis to force to surrender. Nazis being pressed in on all sides, resources dwindling. By April, the Russians began their attack on Berlin. Hitler had sunk himself into a bunker for protection. April 29th, he marries his longtime mistress, and on the wedding night, Hitler dictates his will, muttering to the end that he had been betrayed, Germany didn't deserve him, and urging his forces to fight on to the end. But in those few weeks he's in that bunker, hardly seen by the public, and increasingly erratic, giving out orders to units that didn't even exist anymore, had been destroyed in the fighting or completely surrendered by that point. So Hitler and his mistress, now wife, they're both given a pistol and a capsule of cyanide. They bite down on the cyanide and shoot themselves, committing suicide. Bodies taken outside and burned. Russian troops later discovered the bodies and taken to Moscow for storage. Basically, just the bodies torn apart, the bones put on shelves, cataloged in jars and everything. The Russians actually kept that secret from the Allies for many years, but Hitler's associates who survived did tell the Allies afterward that yes, Hitler had killed himself, and they set the body on fire. Well, once Hitler kills himself, the city in the burning ruins, Admiral Karl Dönitz takes over control of the German government, what's left of it. He spent the next week basically trying to negotiate a surrender with the Allies, that is, with the United States and Great Britain, and not to Russia, knowing what the Russians would do to German prisoners. But the Allies refused. It's going to be unconditional surrender. It's surrender to all of them. So on May 7th, Darnitz, the surviving Nazi command, issued their formal surrender. By this point, by April 30th, the eastern and western fronts had been linked on the Elbe River. And all these slowly, what was remaining of Nazi control was being eliminated. The remaining units after May 7th surrendered, and the Russians, the Americans, the British, and now the French, and the joint occupation would have been Nazi lands. But now you still have the war in the Pacific. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, in October 1944, the Americans were finally able to return to the Philippines. They spent the previous 2 years in the South Pacific on what's called the island hopping campaign. Admiral Chester Nimitz had led this effort, basically going from one island chain to the next, taking out Japanese positions, heavy casualties, but steadily advancing forward. Now Leyte Gulf, after the war started almost 3 years earlier. Leyte Gulf was the gateway to Manila, the capital of the Philippines. The Japanese here would stage one last desperate attempt. They lose their last 4 aircraft carriers, put it in a top new super battleship. The Japanese actually built this huge new battleship, planning just to run it aground, just use the big guns just to fire the American Navy approach. But the battleship was sunk before it even got to the Philippines. But by November, Manila was liberated. But the Japanese would continue to fight for months in the Philippines. In fact, even after the surrender, there were a couple of Japanese soldiers wandering through the wilderness for several years after. The islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were taken in heavy fighting in early 1945. With taking these 2 islands, have long been traditionally considered Japanese territory, but somewhat distant from the mainland. It now meant that all of Japan was within range of American bombers. But the Japanese Air Force, largely wrecked by this point, and increasingly American command in the skies, American primitive bomb at will. But the Japanese were priming for their own defenses, called kamikaze. Divine wind, rough translation from Japanese, meaning referring to an old legend of the Middle Ages when the Mongols attempted to invade Japan by sea. That this miraculous storm, this divine wind, swept the Mongol fleet away, saving Japan from Mongol domination. Well, the modern Japanese pilots were starting to see themselves as divine wind would save Japan from the Americans. Desperate attempt to try to save Japan from a defeat. So increasingly, as the Americans and the British got closer and closer to Japan, especially the Americans, the Japanese would be launching suicide runs, airplanes trying to crash into battleships, aircraft, into troop transports, into manned positions. The mid-1945, the Japanese High Command realized that the Americans would be engaging in a land amphibious assault on Japan at any time. But they were unmoved and remained determined not to surrender. In fact, the Japanese had trained 5,000 new pilots as kamikazes, simply designed to engage in suicide missions, take out as many Americans as they could. Women and children were trained to strap explosives to themselves and hurl themselves at the Americans. American projections of an invasion of mainland Japan, things called Operation Olympic, the first phase of which would be scheduled for November 1945, second phase for February 1946, Tens of thousands of American dead are projected. I believe most of the landing forces, most of those men would be killed. Japanese casualties, probably into the millions. But they knew the Japanese would not surrender. In fact, several Japanese generals up to this point said that they were willing to fight to the very last man, woman, and child. Well, the Russians were starting to come into the war, but the war was going on unabated since the 1930s. Fighting still went on in China. The civilian population being brutalized. 20 million Chinese people would be killed. Fighting in Indochina, elsewhere. It comes down to this Manhattan Project. In 1939, the U.S. began a process of attempting to develop an atomic bomb. The Japanese start researching it themselves. They never went to the development phase. The Germans were attempting to develop their heavy water experiments, but they were disrupted by Allied bombing. Russians and British were also researching it, but couldn't get anything going. It basically is the Americans getting going through a series of labs and research sites and reactors around the country. In New Mexico, Tennessee, Illinois. In fact, there's a nuclear reactor underneath the football field at the University of Chicago. Essentially, the attempt to develop an atomic bomb. Well, there's many attempts to develop all sorts of different weapons to try to attack the Japanese. Well, the first bomb was not exploded until July 16, 1945. Test detonation at Los Alamos, New Mexico. First detonation of an atomic bomb. They weren't quite sure what it was going to do. What ended up happening was the steel tower the bomb was attached to vaporized at the very foundation of it. The sand immediately around the blast site was melted in the glass. The Japanese repeatedly warned that the Americans had this new weapon and would use it on their cities. They did not surrender. The Japanese refused. So portions of the bomb were delivered to Tinian Island. In fact, the ship delivering a lot of these components, the USS Indianapolis, was sunk by a Japanese submarine shortly after. 900 American sailors died. But on August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped. The city of Hiroshima. 70,000 people were killed instantly. Tens of thousands more died of radiation sickness and cancer in the weeks, months, and years afterward. The Japanese remained determined to fight on. American military commanders were preparing to go with Operation Olympic with or without the atomic bombings. 3 days later, another bomb was dropped. Nagasaki, another 70,000 killed. At this point, the Japanese high command is willing to consider surrender. Emperor Hirohito puts his foot down and says we must bear the unbearable and surrender. So this is the U.S. only had 3 atomic bombs at this point. We'd use all 3. It'd be a couple of months for the U.S. could produce another. But the night before the Japanese emperor's surrender message was to be broadcast, several Japanese soldiers attempted a coup to overthrow the emperor. Basically, trying to overthrow the government to keep from surrendering. Hirohito prepared a taped message to be broadcast to the people on August 14th. This is the first time that people would ever hear the voice of their emperor, man. Many have been raised to worship as a god. But on August 14th, Japan surrendered. And that effectively ended the war. World War II was over. Nearly 70 million dead.